It's no secret that writing can be lonely work, but does it really have to be? Whether you're full-time, part-time, or just starting out, you'll get insights into the tricks, tips, and production habits of writers from every level of the biz. From best-selling authors to those launching their first novels, you're sure to be in the company of friends as we encourage great writers to divulge and share their secrets. This is the Great Writers Share podcast with your host, best-selling author, Daniel Wilcox.
Hello and welcome to the Great Writers Share podcast with me, Daniel Wilcox, where every week I hijack an hour or so of time from some of the kindest and hardest working writers around today to join me on the show and discuss everything that makes them tick, roar and bounce. Today's date is the 19th of April and it is day 28 of quarantine. I did have a realisation before I started to record. It has been 4 weeks to the day that quarantine was announced within the UK. It's been a strange ride. And doing everything I can to avoid cabin fever, keeping myself busy. Things like the podcast are helpful because it means I get to speak to some fantastic guests. And I do have a corker of a guest for you today, which I'll go on into a minute. But first, I shall give you my personal update. So in my personal update, my horror Patreon experiment is going pretty well. So I've had a few new followers on Patreon. I've delivered the first few chapters of what will be the prequel to my horror serial. And it seems to be going down pretty well. It's quite nice to have something that keeps you on track and makes you that regularly accountable, because knowing that there are people who have already paid some money to receive the chapters that I've been posting reminds you, number one, to write and to post them. But also because I'm making it sort of public straight away, it's also it pushes me a little bit extra to neaten it up, really make it that quality, because at the end, what I'll likely do once the story's wrapped up is collect it all together, go over it all again and re-upload the entire file so people can see the difference between the first chapters posted and the final finished article. But yeah, it's just a reminder to keep doing that, which is quite fun. But I'm enjoying it and the story's coming out quite well, so I'm happy with that. I have also collected a bunch of responses for people to include in my collaboration book, which I'll start chipping away at over the next few weeks, in the hope of probably getting the collaboration book out in the next couple of months, which I'm excited for, because I genuinely really enjoyed writing this book. And one thing that myself and Joanna Penn, who is today's guest, go into in this interview is the joy, I guess, of writing nonfiction, and also that it is easier than fiction in many ways. And I found it a lot easier to just get the words down, because it's an outpouring of stuff that I already know, as opposed to obviously picturing all the fictional scenarios, trying to work out how characters will interrelate, how it'll affect the storyline further down the line and things like that. So I'm excited to get it put together. I'm happy with where it's at, and yeah, I'll start chipping away at that. And one big announcement, actually I've got one big announcement and a slightly smaller announcement, I guess. One big announcement is, I mentioned last week, the Next Level Author podcast with myself and Sasha Black. That should have gone live by the time this episode airs. It should have gone live on Tuesday the 21st of April. So if you are wanting to dive into some conversations with me and Sasha and find out how to level up your author business, then hop on over onto your podcast feed and check out the Next Level Authors, and join us over on the Facebook group. Just type Next Level Author Podcast or Next Level Authors into Facebook, and you should be able to see Sasha's purple and my royal gold. And the final, the mini announcement, I guess, is I am currently in the process of looking at further content that I can add to this show and further ways that I can bring value to you guys. I've got someone roped in to do something for me, which I can't really, I'm basically just going to tease at this point. I can't really say much more on right now because we're in the process of recording and sorting it all out. But there will be a bit extra coming. The guys over at Patreon know what is up and coming. And yeah, just a few extra things, because what I want to do with the Great Writers Share is really just find ways to add value to you as writers, as listeners, and just to help ease some of the problems that you might have when you're doing your writing. So good stuff coming up, and I'll give you more information on that when I can. Today's guest is Joanna Penn. Joanna and I chatted last on the podcast going back to 2017. I've popped the episode down in the show notes, and that was the podcast that myself and Luke Condor used to do, the Story Studio. And obviously a lot changes in 3 years, and it was nice to have a catch up with Joanna and to get an hour or so of her time just to sit down and ask the questions that I've been dying to ask. Obviously, hopefully get some stuff that's informative for you as well. And some of the things that we went on a whole spectrum of different topics. It was really, really informative, particularly for me. But we go into how Joanna's writing process and approach to business has changed since she first started writing over a decade ago. And we look at things like paying attention to audio, intellectual property, and how you can repurpose and make sure you're making the most of what you've already created. And also direct selling, so cutting out the middleman and just selling directly to your customers. We talk about the unsexy realities of being a full-time author, so how it's not entirely all sunshine and rainbows, and you don't just sit down on a porch and write all day, and what some of the other facets of running your own author business look like. And we talk about the difference between bestseller lists and genre awards and how to put yourself in the best position for both, which for me was really, really interesting because I know that one of my goals is to win a Bram Stoker award at some point. And Joanna is just a fountain of useful information. So stick around and you will find out all about that. Just a quick reminder before we dive into the interview that this episode is brought to you by all my wonderful patrons over at patreon.com/greatwritersshare, where for as little as $1 a month, you can get access to a whole load of extra bonuses, including entry into the Slack group, early access to episodes, ad-free episodes, and a whole lot more. So if you want to get all that good stuff, just head over to www.patreon.com/greatwritersshare. Now, without any further ado, let's dive into the interview with the one and only Joanna Penn. Joanna Penn is an award-nominated New York Times and USA Today best-selling thriller author, as well as a writer of nonfiction for authors. She's written over 30 books and sold over 500,000 books in 84 countries and 5 languages. She's an independent author and also runs a small press, Curl Up Press, with her husband and business partner. Joanna is also an international professional speaker and award-winning creative entrepreneur. In 2018, she was awarded Publishing Commentator of the Year by Digital Book World. Her show, The Creative Penn Podcast, has been downloaded 3.7 million times in 219 countries. Based now in Bath, Joanna is a travel junkie who also likes hiking and relaxing with a book and a glass of pinot noir or a gin and tonic. Hendricks Fever Tree, please. Joanna, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on the show, Dan. And in fact, I have a glass of Pinot Noir right here, right now, because we're post 6 p.m. in the UK. So I think that's fair enough.
What's your official fine time to be able to drink? Is it normally at a 6 p.m. limit?
Well, if it's a weekday, I suppose. But as we should say, as we record this, yes, we're in lockdown for the coronavirus, and I think while in lockdown, the time to drink is any time you like.
Yeah, pretty much. I have found that I've indulged in a couple of sort of whiskeys just occasionally because sometimes you just need it. I mean, how are you cracking along with the coronavirus at the minute where you are?
Well, I think I'm really glad we're locked down, really, because before the official lockdown, my parents were just behaving badly and running around having a good time. And I'm like, please go home, please go home. And then once they announced the lockdown, they're at least behaving. So I think, as you know, for full-time writers, the daytime is pretty similar, but I'm definitely missing my writing cafe. Of course, you mentioned I'm a travel junkie, and that is the biggest thing. I'm like, oh my goodness, I take this for granted. And my husband is a New Zealander, and so his family are the other side of the world, and it's just it's a difficult time for everyone, and we don't want to make light of it, but equally we're not going to talk about it in this show. We're just going to move on.
We're going to move on from that one because I think coronavirus is everywhere. So let's make this a little bit of relief for people. I want to jump into one of the questions I've got here. I've put, arguably, you're one of the mothers of the indie fiction movement. How has the changing world of publishing affected you and your approach to writing books over the past decade?
Well, I'm not sure I'm one of the mothers. I think that's as a happily child-free woman, it's unnecessary. I've definitely been involved for a long time, but in terms of writing, I don't think my writing practice has changed particularly in terms of how the publishing industry has changed. Perhaps the biggest thing has been audio. I mean, because when I started in 2000, I started writing in 2006, first self-published in 2008, and then ebooks came along. And that's been the dominant thing for independent authors. And then realistically, audiobooks, I was one of the first authors in the UK to join ACX when it first launched. I think that was 2014, 2015. And then I've been narrating my own books. And I have found that my writing has changed based on self-narration, particularly for nonfiction at the moment, because that's mainly what I'm narrating. But with my fiction, it's definitely changed the way I write. And mainly that's because we have the opportunities we do with audiobook publishing. And yeah, so that's probably the biggest thing. The fact is, when we first started when I first started as an indie, the main market was the US. It was Kindle only. But now we're in a situation where we can reach pretty much every country in the world. My number of countries sold in is actually 149 countries now. I've sold books. I know. I just updated that on my bio. But yeah, so selling books across the world, and also in libraries, in bookstores, none of that was possible back in the day when I first started out. So what I would say to people is the way that things have changed just mean that there are more and more and more opportunities every single year. Like literally, it used to be ebooks in America were it. And now it literally is every format in every country. I do hardbacks, print on demand. I do audio, large print, as well as the ebooks, paperbacks. So I think it literally is just more and more all the time. And I feel that I haven't even made the most of my intellectual property assets. So I think most authors listening, if you take an inventory of what you have created, you could take it in so many more directions.
It's definitely something that I need to look at with my backlist, because I've got the key ones. There's always the ebook and the paperback, of course there is, but then it's always getting it into all the different other formats as well. Where do you source your information from in order to learn and keep up to date with what is a constantly changing environment?
Oh, good question. I mean, I'm pretty well connected at this point. So a lot of people will tell me. So most of the major companies involved will email me with anything that's going on. I also monitor a lot of blogs. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I read newsletters. I'm involved in various communities at a higher level. So most of my interest is at the higher level, is on, what are the artificial intelligence AI changes that are going to impact authors in the next 5 to 10 years. That's the type of stuff I'm interested in, not necessarily that some company has just introduced more print on demand services or whatever. But obviously many authors, that's where most people are in the sort of day-to-day life. But I mean, podcasting, obviously you and I both podcast. One of the things that makes you stop podcasting is when you get bored with your own material and when you just ask the same questions over and over again. And the Creative Pen is over a decade. The Creative Pen podcast is over a decade old. So I could not be asking the same questions that I used to ask, because I mean, I almost gave it up in 2015. But then I carried on because I was like, right, well, the only way to make this work is by really focusing in on what I find interesting and doing this personal introduction to all my episodes and talking about the other things that are going on in the industry. So I guess, I just read a lot of blogs. I subscribe to a lot in Feedly. I have Feedly on my phone. So if I'm in between things, I'll look at my Feedly app. I'll just surf a few headlines, save a few things. For example, as we speak today, I found something where they can now turn brainwaves into words.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. And I was like, okay, that's pretty cool. And this has been fizzling away in a few levels, but I'm collating evidence for when we can just think. But I mean, most of us struggle enough with dictation. So, I mean, I'm not sure we could write books with our minds.
I would be interested to see how that would come out on just a blank piece of paper.
Yeah, it would really not be good. It would need a lot of editing.
I'd love to go back to a bit more of the beginning of your journey and talk a little bit about when you first, I mean, obviously you've told the story about moving from your old day job into writing a lot. You had your note inside your purse about you were a full-time creative and wanting to jump out and do that full-time. When you were first getting pen to paper, what did your writing process look like then? How did you approach that first moment of, okay, I'm going to try my hand at writing?
Well, I started off with nonfiction, and I think nonfiction is much, much easier. Sorry if people listening write nonfiction, but I do think nonfiction is much easier because you take what you know and you do some more research and you put it in an order. And I was a business consultant and I did a lot of presentations. So I always did speaking. I would go into a company and we would research the company and then we'd present things. So I was very used to doing PowerPoint presentations as a business consultant. And I took a similar approach. This was before I don't even know if Scrivener existed in 2006, but essentially I still base a lot of my nonfiction stuff on, PowerPoint slides or keynote because I'm Mac now. But this idea of structure for nonfiction is really important. So essentially, I wrote that first book was called Career Change. I just started writing and organizing my thoughts. I did a lot of research for that book. I read a ton of books. I used to go to this library back in the day when you used to go to a physical library and get physical books. And then put it all together. So structuring, and my process for nonfiction with Scrivener is so much easier because you drag and drop things around. It's brilliant. I don't know how anyone does it. I actually think I did do different Word documents per chapter because it was the only way to kind of organize it in a hierarchy.
Oh, wow.
Knowing that this chapter would be about, health, and this chapter would be about something else. And I just wanted to move things around. So yeah, definitely that first book took me a lot longer. And then fiction, I actually did, for my first novel, I did the year of the novel after I had done NaNoWriMo. So I started writing fiction in NaNoWriMo 2009, I think it was. And then I did year of the novel at a local library in Queensland, Australia. And at the end of the year, I had a draft and then I went into editing and all that kind of thing. So definitely, as everybody knows, your writing process becomes more organized over time. But I definitely don't think it makes it any easier.
And obviously in the beginning, when you are writing, obviously you had that goal of, I want to make this full time. I want my books to be successful. I want to run this as a full time business. And that was almost the thing, I'm guessing, that kept you accountable. What is it now, 10, 15 years later, that keeps you accountable to what you're trying to deliver?
My podcast is awesome. I mean, really, at the moment, especially coming back to the coronavirus, many of us at the moment, there are some days where you just wonder why bother? Why don't I retrain as a nurse or a doctor or something? Be far more useful to society. And then you realize that actually you can be useful in your way. And many people, and I decided to carry on with my podcast, and people have emailed me and said thank you for carrying on, and obviously, or most of us are finding solace from the world in art, and we're reading books, we're watching TV shows, we're escaping into fiction. So then you reframe the world and you say, oh, okay, actually what I do is valuable to a certain group of people, and that's, I'd be a useless nurse or doctor, so I'm not going to go that way. But in terms of accountability, one, this is my income, it's my household income, so that's one thing. Like, you have to pay the bills, so that keeps the business running. The second thing, the podcast is great because every week I have to say what I've been doing in terms of my writing. And thirdly, my own creative drive, in that the more you write, the more books you have to write. I mean, my list of books to write is huge. It's about 15 books at the moment.
Oh, wow.
And every time you write a book, you realize that there are more books you need to write. And I'm also creating online courses at the moment and doing that kind of thing because that helps in other ways. But I think all of that, I mean, I'm a very driven, self-directed person anyway. I don't need someone telling me I have a deadline. My deadline is, very, I'm always working. I'm a workaholic and I love it. But yeah, I think all of those things. But the other thing is, people say, oh, you're so disciplined. I'm totally not disciplined. You should see, well, hence the wine and the stock of Cadbury's cream eggs that I have downstairs.
I did like that anecdote in your newsletter. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. But so my discipline it's not discipline. It's what I want to do with my life. So I don't think you need discipline if it's something you want to do. You need discipline when it comes to things like don't eat that chocolate. That's when you need the discipline.
Yeah. And one of the things that I found particularly at the minute with, and we say we're not going to touch on coronavirus, but obviously it's everywhere at the minute, is that over the past week, just over a week that we've been in lockdown, my life in terms of work hasn't been affected either too, because one thing it has given me more confidence in is the fact that I do love what I do. So it's not like I'm sat around bored trying to find things to do. I'm actively wanting to get these things done. Is it similar for you?
Yeah, in fact, I have more to do. What I am finding difficult is fiction, mainly because my fiction writing process is to go to a cafe and sit at a specific table and at a specific time. And and this room where we're talking, this is my home office where I do my accounting, I do my podcasting, I do my interviews, I do my marketing, I do emails. And it's a very, very difficult for me to do fiction in the same space physically and mentally than I do everything else. So what are we in week 2 as we talk? We're just over a week in, day 8 or something.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I'm allowing myself a couple of weeks to get other things done. So I've got nonfiction, I'm doing courses, I'm doing lots of other stuff business wise to make money. But in a couple of weeks time, if I haven't knuckled down to it, then I'm going to have to invent some new scenario. And this is a bit of a tip though for people. You have to do your fiction writing somewhere else to your other things. So for example, if you're a gamer and you're sitting in a particular chair to do your gaming, you're going to really struggle to write fiction at that same desk, because we humans like habits, we like, routine. And as a professional creative and a professional writer, we have to create the routines that enable us to do our job. And so what's happened with this is my normal fiction routine has been broken so badly because I can't go to my, I just can't go to my desk in my cafe. So what I might do, I'm kind of eyeing up the kitchen table downstairs. Maybe I can trick myself into that. But it is interesting because I've spent many years so there's this particular table and this particular cafe I've been writing at for about 5 years now. So for me to switch out of that into another physical place is quite difficult, and that's it been interesting. And so I realize that some people can write anywhere. I don't really believe it. I think that most full-time creatives have a routine and they have to stick to it in order to deliver in some way. What do you think?
No, I'm very, very similar, and I'm not along as you're saying a lot of that stuff, because there's a cafe that I've started going to probably about 6 months ago, and I always get the same chair at the same table every day. It just happens to be where I go. And one of my worries at the minute is that I don't think it will happen because it's quite a big chain store, but my worry is that all of this Corona stuff will be over and then they'll just be out of business and I'll have to find somewhere else, which is obviously a bit of a worry. And you make new routines, you make new habits. But no, I'm definitely the same. I've got a place in which I get most of my fiction down. And I've only recently started going to nonfiction. And I do that where I'm sitting now, and I do the podcast here. And just having those two different setups, it gets you into a completely different mindset. And I'll change like playlists as well, because I've got one playlist I listen to for fiction and then another one now that I've associated with nonfiction. So I think it's massively actually underestimated how that can stimulate you properly and get you into the zone much, much quicker. And I think you're right. A lot of the people that jump around and think that they can write everywhere would benefit quite a lot from finding the place where they can set up shop and make it happen.
Yeah. And I think it's completely true. Getting into that flow state, I just have not been able to do since being at home for fiction. So, but in this case, I think it's also that feeling guilty. I don't want to feel guilty about not writing. I don't want to give myself any kind of negative energy around writing fiction. It's got to stay as a positive thing in my mind. So I'm not going to force myself to do that unless we get into months and months of this. So, things will be different, because I am, what am I 40,000 words into a novel right now.
Nice.
So I know that's going to be difficult to get back into. But what I'll have to do is come up with some new hacks and hack my process. But if you're, people listening, identify the things that help you get into the zone and then try and replicate that as regularly as possible. And that's going to help you create more.
What does a normal writing day look like for you?
Yeah, well, with the cafe, I would get up and be at the cafe at 7 and then work on whatever first draft material At the moment it would be Map of the Impossible, my third, Matt Walker dark fantasy, and then at about 9:30 I go and do exercise, so yoga or weight training or walking or something. And so I really, I am a professional writer, but really 2.5 hours a day is about it for me for first draft material. And then I will after the exercise, I'll come back, then it's lunchtime, and then I'll do business stuff. So blogging, podcasting, interviews, accounting, all the things that you have to do to run a business, marketing, all that type of stuff. So basically for me, it's creating in the morning and business in the afternoon. And many people always say, oh, you're not a full-time writer. It's like, yeah, this is the reality. The reality is, now, the reality is not, oh, I just get up and write all day. I mean, there are some authors who do that, but they are generally traditionally published. People like Stephen King, who have whole teams who manage the rest of that stuff for them. But if you're trying to be an independent, for example, then you have to do all the other things too. And I enjoy that. That's the other important thing. I enjoy the other stuff. I love business. I think business is just as creative as producing books.
Yeah, it's definitely helpful when you can enjoy every single part of it. And you've alluded to a couple of times there that obviously you do a lot of stuff. You've got your nonfiction, you've got your fiction, you've got the podcast, you've got a whole host of the other stuff that you get on with. How do you organize yourself and make sure you don't let any of those balls drop? Do you use any specific software? Do you have any particular methods to actually managing and keeping track of what you're currently doing?
Well, I have on my wall, I have to do, and it has the big stuff. So it has health. Health is at the top. And then it says Map of the Impossible. And then it says Arcane 11, which is my next novel. And then it says How to Write a Novel, which is something I've got 90,000 word draft of. I need to edit that. So I've got basically on the wall are the big projects in big writing. And then I have Google Calendar on my phone. I basically manage everything through Google Calendar. Obviously, we booked this time in Google Calendar. So that's a really important tool for me. Then on the smaller level, I have the Things app. And that's Mac only, but it's on my phone and the laptop. And that's much smaller. That's like add keywords to this field on this book, that type of thing, little things. And that to-do list every day, sometimes it's just, but then I just move things forward. And so that's a small tracker, but it's like my external brain. Some people use Evernote. I just don't get on with Evernote. So I use Things app. And I'll also put quotes in there. I'll put fiction ideas. I basically use that app for everything, birthdays, everything. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, and then of course it's episodic work. So my podcast goes out every Monday. So I know that on every Friday, I prepare, record my introduction and send it over to my audio guy, Dan. And so I know that always happens on a Friday. And then, email list thing happens on a Monday. So I have these things that happen every week. And that's a sort of more episodic. I don't actually need to remind myself of that. Although I do still have in my calendar, I'll do intro to podcast is on a Friday. And even things like, check bank accounts, do make sure the money's in the right place, businessy stuff that you have to do when you're a full-time creative. So if people don't realize, like if you run your own business, nobody else puts money in your bank account. You still have to pay yourself. You still have to deal with your taxes and pay your bills. So all of that type of thing, I have slots in my calendar for as well. So I stay on top of it because I think, and this is important to say, because many creative people don't like to engage with that type of thing, and that's how they get into trouble. Like it's very common to see people get their taxes out of whack or not account for different business things that they need to account for. So that's something that I keep a very tight rein on.
Now, it's something that I learned the hard way, because I was a freelance editor and proofreader for a couple of years, going back 5 or 6 years now. And I only did it for about 2 years or so before my son was born. But in that time, I pretty much made every single one of those mistakes of being disorganized, not tracking taxes, everything else. So
done.
Thank you. But it's lessons now. So I obviously use that time now. I've gone into full-time authorship, and it's stuff that I now am so hyper aware of that I do keep on top of that stuff. But I do find that as someone who's not traditionally very, very organized, it takes a lot for me to start getting the ball rolling. And I use Google Calendars a lot for everything now, and I've got sort of your regular reminders and different things. Were you always that organized going into this, or has it been something that you've slowly developed over time?
Well, it's funny because you reminded me with my very first paycheck. Well, out of college, I joined Accenture, which is now what used to be called Anderson Consulting, a consulting firm. And my very first paycheck, I bought a leather-bound Filofax. This is 1997. I bought a Filofax, and I had that Filofax. I used that Filofax. If people don't know what that is, it's like a small binder with a leather cover with all the calendar in, but it's a physically handwritten calendar. So I only stopped using that about 3 or 4 years ago. And I used to use a lot of Tipex. Again, Tipex is one of those things I don't even know if it exists anymore, but it's like that white
I can't say
out.
I've seen it, no.
I think they call it white out in America. So I would just redo this organization. But no, I guess I've always been quite organized. And this is another thing about being an independent author. I think if people listening are feeling like that's a complete nightmare, well, I don't think it's unfair to say that if you are not organized like yourself, you had to get organized. And if you don't want to deal with money, well, you're going to have to deal with money. And if you don't want to learn technology, well, sorry, you're going to have to learn some technology. And I feel like to be a successful independent author, author entrepreneur, creative entrepreneur, whatever you want to call it, you do have to get to grips with some skills that you might feel are not creative in some way, and you just have to get to grips with them. For example, the accounting side, I use software called Xero, xero.com. It's absolutely brilliant, but it's a bit like anything. It takes a couple of hours to get to grips with, and once you've dealt with it and you can work with an accountant, it's something that the investment of a few hours will help you no end and will stop the pain of a future, thing you have to do with an accountant who just has a go at you. So I would urge people, if you're serious, if you're listening and you're serious about doing this full time, you do have to learn some of these skills. And they may just, as I said, be a couple of hours, and the investment will last for your whole career. So it's well worth it.
You mentioned earlier as well that you are still keeping up with your strength training. You've got a personal trainer at the minute because one of your goals is to get fitter, to get stronger. What lessons have you learned from finding a personal trainer, and has your writing in any way surprisingly crossed over into that barrier of health?
Well, to be honest, I've always I've had personal trainers for many years. But what happened when I moved to Bath, and the other thing is, I think I'm 45, and when you're younger than me for sure.
Be generous.
Yeah, you look like a millennial.
Yes. Ooh,
Yes.
I think I'm slightly above a millennial, I hope. Not in like status, that came out wrong. Let's move on.
But the point is, if you do a desk job, so I've basically been doing a desk job since 1997, you're going to end up with some kind of chronic injuries from desk work. And what happened to me last year in 2019 was my right shoulder had been bothering me for years, and it basically went into chronic pain situation. And so I got back into weights, which I'd lost for a few years. And so what was interesting to me, I think, is how much I love it, and I'd lost it. And I really love lifting weights. In fact, it's funny because this morning we're again in lockdown, but I'm training via Skype with my trainer. I have a couple of kettlebells at home, so I'm getting some good workouts in, to be honest. But how it's helped my writing is I'm not in pain. So this is a big deal. I got to the point where I was in chronic pain and I couldn't do my job properly. And what I would say to people listening again, and I co-wrote The Healthy Writer with a medical doctor, Dr. Ewan Lawson, a few years ago. But I feel like health is cyclical in that you don't just fix it once. You have to stay on top of it, and you have to engage with it every day, really. And that's the way you're going to be able to write for the long term. You have to be physically well, and if you're not, then your writing is going to suffer. I know so many writers who have medical issues and health issues and postural issues. I mean, basically, I had, if everyone thinks of the slumped forward rolling shoulder issue, that's what I had so much that it was pinching the nerves in my arms.
Ouch.
Yeah. And so I was getting a lot of pain, and it wasn't RSI. It was my scapulars, my shoulder blades, everything. So I need to correct my posture. So what's so fascinating to me is re-engaging with the physical body is just making my writing so much better, and I just feel better. I mean, life is better when you feel good. So I would urge people, if you have pain, you have to deal with it, especially if you're in your 30s, 40s. You have to deal with it at any age, but if you're and I basically ignored that pain for probably a decade until it got that bad, whereas I should have started dealing with it much, much earlier. But, like we all do, you only deal with it when it really, really hurts.
That's the problem, isn't it? I had a back issue that struck me out of nowhere last year around February 2019. That lasted a good 6 months, and that came just from sitting a lot of the time, from not lifting things, not heavy things, but just regularly not paying attention to how I lift things and getting that exercise. And like you say, it's not until it actually debilitates you that you actually pay attention and go, okay, I need to find a way to fix this.
I would say also my trainer now, he's also Dan. I have so many Dans in my life. But I really respect his domain specific expertise. And again, I would say to writers, the reason we work with editors, the reason we work with book cover designers, the reason you work with a personal trainer who specializes in shoulder rehab is because they have domain specific experience that you do not have, and you cannot get it just from YouTube videos. So when people say, for me, being an independent author also means working with professionals. So hiring editors, hiring cover designers, hiring people who know what they're doing. And that's something, again, I feel very much like I've learned this lesson again. I don't just want to go to a gym and do a class. I want someone who knows what they're doing with the physical anatomy and can help me specifically. So the importance of paying professionals has also come back to me.
Yeah, I think that investment is definitely worth it. And like you say, it comes back and pays itself back in the long run.
Definitely.
You've got a slew of nonfiction behind you. How do you choose the subject of your next nonfiction? Are you at a point yet where you feel like you've covered everything, or are there many more topics that you wish to cover?
Oh, I keep thinking I am done. As I said, like this, I've had a draft of how to write a novel for a number of years, but you feel like Stephen King wrote a book on how to write a novel, so I can't. But I have actually thought of a way I can deal with this now, so that one might be coming out. But Audio for Authors, which is my latest nonfiction, I wrote that because loads of authors were asking me the same questions. So that's normally how it works. It's all these people are asking me questions. How do I get away from having to answer over and over again? And so having a book on that topic helps. So productivity for authors was the same thing. Just common questions that people ask. So I do have a couple more nonfiction in mind, but also I want to start doing nonfiction under my JF Penn name, which is my fiction name, but I want to start doing nonfiction around themes of my fiction. So, for example, I'm going to write a travel memoir, and that's going to go under JF Penn. Because all my fiction is different places in the world, and I've got the Books and Travel podcast, which goes with that name. And so I'm starting to look at what other nonfiction I want to write that will help my other books. And I do think nonfiction is fantastic. I think everyone should write nonfiction as well. It's much, much easier, as I said. It's much easier to sell as well.
That's good to know. Like I say, I'm working on my first nonfiction at the minute, so that'll be an interesting one to approach and see how that goes. With being such a recognizable face in the independent author community, is there ever a time where you feel the pressure of so many eyes watching you and what you're doing, or do you try very much to focus on just doing your own thing and marching to your own drumbeat?
Well, it's funny you say that. I don't really feel that most of the time. I mean, we're in a very small niche, and most of the time my conversations happen like this, and it's just me in my room and it's you in your room. I mean, no one else is here. So, I mean, sure, some people might listen to this at some point, but who knows? And to be fair, I still feel that. And when I record my podcast introduction every Friday, I'm just in my little booth in the corner. No one else is there. It's just me. And so, I don't know. I think part of the good thing about being an independent is that you can just create what you want to create. And although I do try to serve my audience in some way, I think that most of the time what I do is based on just wanting to do that project. Look, let's be honest, we're a tiny niche, and a few people might know my name, but it's, again, it's not Stephen King, is it? It's not some big super niche. So I think sometimes we worry too much about that. I mean, generally, I just get annoyed when my own family do read my stuff, or and then it's like I put out on Books and Travel podcast. I did a little podcast on home, the importance of home in difficult times. And it was quite emotional for me. And then I get this message, and my mother-in-law listened to it. And I was like, and it was fine. I didn't say anything bad, but I'm actually more impacted if someone I know reads my stuff. Like, my husband doesn't read any of my stuff, so I just carry on with my life.
Is that deliberately because of you, or just because he chooses not to?
He's just not, he's like most people's spouses, partners, life partners, whatever. He just reads other things. He really likes epic fantasy, which I don't write. So that's why he's just not interested. Fair enough.
No, I've got my dad at the minute is working through one of my series, which it's nothing along the lines of the stuff that he normally reads, but he keeps coming back to me every few months and just going, "I've read the next one." And you have that awkward exchange where I'm like, "Did you enjoy it?" And he just goes, "Yeah." But you can't dig deeper because it's your dad, and he's not going to say negative things and this, and
I know you write darker stuff as well, don't you? And yes. my mum did read one of my darker books, Desecration, I think she read, and she basically said, "What did I do something wrong with your upbringing?" I'm like, "No, Mum. No, it's fine, really." Yeah. But so I think it's better if the people who know us don't read our work.
Definitely. I know my mum hasn't read any of my stuff yet, but she continually just keeps moaning at me again. "Why can't you write romance or something lovely?"
Something nice.
Because it just doesn't interest me, Mum. You've got a fair amount of accolades behind you, and you've hit bestseller lists. You've done fantastic things with your work. Have your accolades in any way benefited your work? And if so, where would you say those examples would lie?
This is a really good question, and it's something that I think as independent authors who have always been independent, so I've never been traditionally published in English, have been in translation, but we don't have any validation from the industry. And this is something that affects us in a self-confidence manner. So I am so proud of being an award-nominated author with the ITW, the International Thriller Writers. So that's my genre's my genre organization. I have a goal. I mean, I would just love to win a Bram Stoker. I've never even submitted to the Bram Stoker Awards.
You'll be up against me.
Yeah, exactly. So that means a lot. And the reason that means a lot, because I have, been a judge in many of these things. I'm part of judging panels, and is you are judged by your peers. And that means a lot. So I really, really do want to win a genre specific prize so that I am recognized by my peers. So that's why award nominated is in my bio, because that means a great deal. The New York Times thing is not even possible now for indies to do in the way that I did back in 2014. This was when you could hit the list as a multi-author box set. So it's not possible anymore. And the USA Today, you can still do that And I've done that on my own as well. But those things are games. And that's what everyone has to realize. That is playing the game and playing it well enough to make the list. And so those things are very I don't want to disparage anyone who wants those goals, but we decided to play a game. We played it well. And we found out the rules and we did it. And that's how many people, like if you do some research on something like the New York Times, it's very much a game, and the traditional publishers will play the game too. You and I are in the UK, the Sunday Times list. We can't even play that game because it's not open to us. The Booker Prize, that's not open to us. So there are games you can play and games you can't play. And so in terms of accolades, I don't think of them as accolades. The only accolade I would really like is a genre award by my peers. The other stuff, as far as I'm concerned, is not that necessary. It's just a ticket. It's almost like a little ticket, a little tick next to your name that says played the game, did that well at that moment in time. Sadly, I think many people think it means more before. I mean, I would still love to hit the New York Times as a single author with a hardback or something. I mean, yeah, that would be great, but I can't play that game, so I'm not going to. So yeah, my tip for everyone would be, if you want to play those games, go find out the rules and then go for it. You have to spend some money. You have to do some spike advertising. You have to get all the things, all your ducks in a row, all your book bubs and your ads and blah, blah. And I've put all that on the website. So people can find that in the show notes. I guess I'll send you some links or something.
Yes, please.
Yeah, but it's really, I think the important thing is for everyone listening, what do you really, really want? And for me, my number one goal is to carry on doing this, to not go back to a day job. And so it's making that money that will enable me to not go back to my day job, right? And the best way to do that is actually to sell direct, which is hilarious. Just completely bypass any of the stores and sell direct by email to customers. You make the most money, you get the data of the customer, and no one will ever know about that sale. So it's completely unrecognized sale in any list, but you get the money in your bank account. So there's a big difference in these goals, and every author has to figure out what they want the most. And the other thing is, you can get everything you want, but not at the same time. So I have 45 years in which to hit the Bram Stoker, and you have a bit longer.
It'll be an interesting race. But I'm sure you'll get there first. It's interesting you say that about the Sunday Times and the USA Today stuff, because the way that I don't know if it's just what I've interpreted it as, but sometimes those genre-specific awards can also feel like a game in a way as well when you do go up against your peers and that. Is that something that you'd agree with at all, or do you think it's a bit more...
yeah, I mean, you can't discount the importance of networking. You do have to play that game. But I do believe, as I said, having been in various judging panels, that the quality of the work, I mean, I have read, for some of these things, you have to read like 1,000 books, and it is very, very clear what quality is in a genre. And quality is a difficult word to talk about with indies. But I got to say, it's very evident. And some of those books that are not good quality are traditionally published. And some of those books are indie. I mean, I can read, particularly in the thriller genre, I can read like 50 lookalike thrillers. Exactly. I know exactly what this is. And then I'll read something that's stunning. And you just know. And when it works because there's always panels of judges. And if everyone comes up with the same names, that those books, and obviously I can't go into too many details, but a book like the year before last, all of us said the same book should win, and that book did win. And it was like, yeah, that book was the correct book. And so it's kind of evident. And the reason why these games are good to play in terms of genre is it shows you what a good book in that genre should read like. I mean, you know the Bram Stoker, right?
Yeah.
There are some incredible books on the Bram
Some
Stoker.
fantastic ones, yeah.
Just brilliant. So stunning that you just wish you had written that book. And so that's why I like why I read a lot of the award winners and award nominated books, because they are very, very good. And yes, I'm a businesswoman. I like making money. But I also want to improve my craft, as do you and everybody listening. And a really good way to improve your craft is to read a lot of these books and like figure out, okay, why did this win? So have you read Christopher Golden's Ararat?
I haven't, no.
Okay, that won a few years ago, the Bram Stoker. Absolutely brilliant book. A perfect example, to me, a perfect horror novel. Perfect.
All right, going on the list.
Yeah. So, and everyone listening, if you like reading horror, perfect horror novel, horror thriller. And you read it and you go, okay, I know why this won. I know why is this so good? And you can deconstruct what works. And so I think that's why looking at these genre awards are more important than the bestseller lists, because they have been read and judged by people who read in the genre, and it's almost like the wisdom of the crowds, I think, to a point.
Yeah, definitely gives me more faith, because I was a little bit like I guess on the fence about whether or not to go for it because of that stuff, but obviously given what you said, that's restored some faith there.
And especially in horror, oh my goodness, the quality is so high. It's so high in horror. Like you and I aiming for the Bram Stoker is quite a high bar.
We'll see. Oh man, big steps to jump up. I've got one more question within my main segment, and then I've probably got time for one Patreon question before we go into the quickfire round. Okay. My last question that I ask all of my guests, feel free to take it in any direction that you would like, is why do you, Joanna Penn, write?
Because it is the way my default artistic sense. I think everyone has a default, and I think writers write like we're not visual. Some people have a bit of both, but for me, I write because I always have written journals and I've always written. I don't know what I think unless I write. So for me, it just is the thing that I do. And now also it's the thing that makes me money. So I guess that's
always nice when they match up.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is. And yeah, what I would say to people is, if you just write stuff because that's how you figure things out in your brain, then you're probably a writer.
Fantastic. So I've got a question now from one of my patrons over at www.patreon.com/greatwritersshare. And this one is from Mark McClure, who says, how are sales for large print books going, nonfiction and fiction?
So large print romance. So I have co-written some sweet romance with my mum, no sex please, and under Penny Appleton. And the book that sells the most in large print is Love Second Time Around, which has 2 mature adults on the front of the book, so people in their 60s. It's a mature romance, and that sells a lot in large print. Unsurprisingly, really, because that's the market. That is a really good market for large print. So I think that's about 30% of those sales are large print. So that's significant. Off the top of my head, I don't know the breakdown for the other things, but what I do know is that why wouldn't you do it? So every book now I put out in ebook, paperback, large print and hardback, because they're print on demand. You can do them with vellum. You just change, the font size, stick a large print thing on your cover. Why wouldn't you do it? There's really no need to not do it. Libraries like large print books. So I think I will be doing my next data thing in June or July, so maybe circle back and have a look at that, because this will be my first year of doing a lot more large print.
Exciting. Okay, so into our quick fire round now. So I've got 10 questions that I'm going to throw at you as quickly as possible. Feel free to pass at any point. There's no pressure. It's literally all just for fun. But are you ready to go?
Okay.
Lara Croft or Indiana Jones?
Oh, clearly Lara.
If you could have any non-conventional animal as a pet, what would it be?
Snake.
Chocolate or wine?
Both.
Boats or planes?
Depends what for, I suppose. If it's a long distance, a plane.
Who was the last writer to make you cry?
Oh, I'm not much of a crier in reading, to be honest.
Fair. If you could live as one of your characters for a day, who would it be?
Morgan Sierra, my main character in Arcane, who is, secret agent and clearly my alter ego.
Snow-covered mountains or sun-drenched beaches?
I'm not really a beach or a mountain person, really. I like deserts.
Okay.
And I like the canal and, but yeah.
Do you have a lucky charm?
No.
How many pairs of shoes do you own?
I have quite a lot of walking boots.
Nice. What's your favourite book of all time?
Oh, so you see, that's just such an unfair question because we all have so many. Yeah, it changes. Probably, well, a book that comes back into our discussion on genre is The Stand by Stephen King, which I am actually listening to on audiobook right now.
It's big.
And I've read it a number of times. This is also the unabridged author's edition audiobook. It's like 45 hours. But The Stand is again a very perfect but it is about a flu virus that kills the whole world.
Maybe wait a little bit before people start reading that one, yeah.
Yeah, but I think, in terms of a great example, that The Stand by Stephen King is a goodie.
Spot on. And that's 10 questions. I've got one more question for you, which is where can my listeners find out everything about yourself and all that you're working on?
Well, for writers, thecreativepen.com and the Creative Pen podcast with a double N. And my fiction, if you like, books and travel, come along to the Books and Travel podcast. And my fiction is under JF Penn, F for Francis.
Perfect. And I'll link to all of that in the show notes. Well, Joanna, thank you so much for sharing some time with me. Really appreciate being on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan.
No worries. Thanks everyone for listening, and I will see you next week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Great Writers Share podcast. Next week, we'll be talking to horror author and the host of This Is Horror podcast, Michael David Wilson. Don't forget you can get early access to every episode of the Great Writers Share podcast and the chance to ask upcoming guests any of your questions just by becoming a patron of the show. All you need to do is visit www.patreon.com/greatwritershare and support the show for as little as $1 a month. One more time, that's www.patreon.com/greatwritershare. Until next time.